The morning rush had barely settled when Diego Alvarez wiped the sweat from his brow and tied his apron a little tighter. His shift at Café Sol, a cozy yet lively spot nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, had started before the sun peeked over the city skyline. The place smelled of freshly brewed coffee, cinnamon pastries, and the unmistakable aroma of sizzling chorizo. It was the kind of comforting scent that reminded Diego of home, of his grandmother's small kitchen in Oaxaca, where love was measured in the spices she mixed into her dishes. But here, in the bustling cafe, love wasn't always reciprocated. Diego had worked in the U.S. for 6 years now, tirelessly splitting his time between 3 jobs. This cafe in the morning, a food truck at night, and occasional construction work on weekends. He never complained. He couldn't afford to. With 2 younger siblings back in Mexico counting on him, every dollar he earned was a promise kept. He'd become a favorite among regular customers. The elderly couple who came in every Wednesday swore by his tamales. The college students pulling all-nighters always asked for his café de olla instead of regular coffee. Even his manager, Susan Carter, often praised his dedication. But for every appreciative customer, there was another who saw him as just the help. That morning, Diego had barely placed a fresh basket of pan dulce on the counter when the bell above the cafe door jingled aggressively. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive navy suit strode in, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tiles. His Rolex gleamed under the soft pendant lights, and his expression screamed impatience. Ronald Spencer. Diego knew the type all too well. Ronald had been to Café Sol before, a corporate executive with an inflated ego and a habit of treating service workers as invisible. Diego braced himself as the man approached the counter, already tapping at his watch. Finally, Ronald muttered, as if Diego had personally kept him waiting. Black coffee, no sugar, and a turkey sandwich. Fast. Diego nodded. Sigh, Señor. Right away. He moved quickly, but not hurriedly. His grandmother had always told him that food prepared in a rush lost its soul. He brewed a fresh cup of the cafe's signature roast and began assembling the sandwich with careful precision. But Ronald wasn't in the mood for patience. Come on, he snapped. How hard is it to make a simple sandwich? Diego clenched his jaw. It wasn't the first time he'd been spoken to like this. It wouldn't be the last. Susan, who had been refilling the pastry display, glanced over, sensing tension. She shot Diego a reassuring look, but before she could intervene, Ronald took things further. Is English hard for you or something? He scoffed, crossing his arms. Maybe that's why this is taking so damn long. The cafe, once filled with quiet conversations and the clinking of coffee cups, grew silent. A few regulars turned to watch, discomfort etched on their faces. Diego's fingers tightened around the sandwich bread. He wanted to fire back, to remind this man that he was more than his accent, more than a worker behind a counter. But years of swallowing his pride had taught him that defending himself often led to more trouble than it was worth. Lo siento, Señor, he said instead, his voice even. Just making sure everything is perfect. Ronald scoffed. Perfect? It's a damn sandwich, not a Michelin star dish. Just give it to me already. Diego set the plate down on the counter with more force than necessary. Here you go, sir. Ronald took one look at it and sneered. Jesus, do you even know how to make a proper sandwich? This is pathetic. He shoved the plate aside, causing the sandwich to tumble onto the counter. Maybe if you spent more time learning real skills instead of flipping tortillas, you wouldn't be stuck behind a counter. A sharp inhale swept through the cafe. Someone muttered, "That's uncalled for." Susan stepped forward, ready to intervene. But before she could, another voice spoke up. A voice so familiar, so unexpectedly calm yet commanding, that it made everyone turn. That's enough. The cafe fell into absolute silence. Diego blinked, his heart hammering as he turned toward the source of the voice. Sitting in the farthest booth, wearing a plain black t-shirt and jeans, was Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. He had been sitting there quietly the entire time, a paperback novel open in front of him, and a barely touched cup of coffee in his hand. No one had noticed him at first. His presence was unassuming, his demeanor as humble as if he were just another cafe regular. But now, as he slowly rose from his seat and walked toward the counter, the air in the room changed. Keanu's kind eyes held no malice, no anger, just quiet authority. And yet, in that moment, Ronald looked almost uneasy. "You don't talk to people like that," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. Ronald, caught off guard, let out a short laugh. "Excuse me? Who the hell are you?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Just a guy who knows respect goes both ways." Diego felt frozen in place. He had seen plenty of celebrities in Los Angeles, but never had one stepped up for him like this. His fingers curled into fists, emotions warring inside him. Gratitude, shock, a flicker of hope. Ronald, still not realizing exactly who he was dealing with, scoffed. "Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm a paying customer. If I want to complain about bad service, I will." Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he picked up the discarded sandwich, carefully placing it back on the plate. Then, looking directly at Diego, he asked, "Did you make this?" Diego swallowed, nodding. Sigh. Keanu smiled. "Then I'm sure it's incredible." Without breaking eye contact with Ronald, he took a deliberate bite of the sandwich. The cafe held its breath. After chewing thoughtfully, he gave a satisfied nod. "This is fantastic," Keanu said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "One of the best sandwiches I've had in a long time." The words weren't just spoken, they were meant. Diego saw it in Keanu's expression, in the way he carefully took another bite, savoring it. Ronald's face turned red. "You've got to be kidding me." Keanu set the sandwich down and finally turned his full attention to Ronald. "Tell me," he said evenly, "when was the last time you made something with your own hands? Something real. Something that took effort." Ronald blinked. "I'd what?" "You look like a guy who lets other people do the hard work for you," Keanu continued, his voice steady. "You probably sit in a big office, making decisions that affect people you never meet. But have you ever actually built something? Cooked something? Created something from scratch?" Ronald faltered. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "Diego here. He does that every single day. And not just for himself, but for others. That's the kind of work that deserves respect." Silence stretched across the cafe. Then, as if on cue, a slow clap started from an older man at a nearby table. Then another, and another. Soon, the entire cafe erupted in applause. Diego stood frozen, emotion swelling in his chest. No one had ever defended him like this before, not in such a public, powerful way. Ronald, now visibly uncomfortable, scowled. "This is ridiculous." He grabbed his briefcase. "I don't have time for this nonsense." He turned on his heel and stormed out, the cafe doors swinging shut behind him. The applause grew louder. Susan patted Diego on the shoulder, smiling. Other customers nodded at him in support. But the moment that truly stuck with him was when Keanu turned back to him, offering a warm smile. "You okay?" he asked gently. Diego exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Sigh. Gracias." Keanu grinned. "No need to thank me. But if you ever open your own place someday, I'll be first in line." Diego felt something shift inside him, a seed of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, today wasn't just another hard day's work. Maybe it was the start of something bigger. The cafe was still buzzing from what had just happened. Diego stood behind the counter, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind replaying the moment over and over again. Keanu Reeves had stood up for him. The name alone carried weight. An actor, a legend, and most importantly, a man known for his kindness and humility. But today, Diego had seen it firsthand. Not from a screen, not from a tabloid headline, but in the flesh. And yet, despite all that had just transpired, the work had to continue. He still had orders to fulfill, coffee to pour, and plates to prepare. He took a deep breath and steadied himself, reaching for the next order slip. No time to dwell. But before he could focus on his next task, Keanu Reeves himself walked up to the counter. "Hey," Keanu said casually, leaning on the polished wooden surface as if he were just another friendly customer, and not one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. "You okay?" Diego swallowed hard, suddenly feeling self-conscious. He wiped his hands on his apron and nodded. Sigh. "Thank you for what you did." Keanu waved a hand as if to brush off the gratitude. "No need to thank me. People should treat each other with respect. Simple as that." He glanced around at the lingering eyes in the cafe, then back at Diego. "You good to take a break for a minute?" A break. Diego rarely took breaks, even when Susan insisted. There was always something to do, some task to complete. But today, he hesitated, then gave a small nod. Susan, who had been standing nearby, quickly intervened. "Take 5, Diego. I've got things covered here." Diego removed his apron, feeling oddly exposed without it, and stepped out from behind the counter. Keanu motioned toward a small table in the corner, away from the main bustle of the cafe. As they sat down, Diego felt an odd mixture of nerves and curiosity. "What do you even talk about with Keanu Reeves? How long have you been working here?" Keanu asked, breaking the silence. 3 years, Diego replied. "Mornings here, nights at a taco truck, and construction work when I can get it." Keanu raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's a hell of a schedule." Diego shrugged. "I send money back home. My brother and sister are still in Mexico. They're studying. I don't want them to have to struggle like I did." There was a flicker of something in Keanu's eyes, a deep understanding. "Family first," he said softly. "That's real." Diego nodded. "It's the most important thing." Keanu leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his slightly disheveled hair. "You ever think about doing your own thing? Your own restaurant, maybe?" Diego let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Of course. But dreams are expensive." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying Diego. "So is giving up on them." Diego fell silent, Keanu's words settling into his mind like a slow-burning ember. Just then, the cafe door jingled open again, and Ronald Spencer strode back inside. The entire cafe tensed. The mood shifted instantly. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and all eyes were on the man who had humiliated himself not long ago. Diego's hands instinctively balled into fists under the table. "What now?" Ronald's expression was unreadable, but there was an undeniable stiffness to his posture. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Diego and Keanu, then walked straight toward them. Keanu sat completely still, sipping his coffee, unbothered. When Ronald finally reached the table, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way," he muttered, addressing Diego. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. Diego narrowed his eyes. "Why are you really here?" Ronald exhaled, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at Keanu, as if measuring his words carefully, then back at Diego. "That sandwich, it wasn't bad." Keanu smirked, but let Diego handle the conversation. Diego crossed his arms. "So what do you want?" Ronald hesitated before answering. "I own restaurants, high-end places. I know talent when I see it." He paused, then finally said the words no one expected. "I want to offer you a job." The cafe gasped collectively. Even Keanu seemed slightly intrigued now, though he kept his expression neutral. Diego stared, stunned. "You, what?" Ronald cleared his throat. "I have an opening for a sous chef. The pay is better than what you make here, and if you prove yourself, there's room to grow." Diego had no words. Keanu, however, leaned forward slightly, watching both men closely. "Why the change of heart?" he asked. Ronald's jaw tightened. "Let's just say, I had a conversation with someone who reminded me what real hard work looks like." Diego's mind raced. This was an opportunity, a chance at something bigger. But could he really work for a man who had looked down on him just an hour ago? Could he trust that this wasn't just some business move, some calculated way to save face? Keanu seemed to sense Diego's turmoil. He spoke gently. "A job's just a job. The question is, do you see yourself growing there? Or do you have something bigger in mind?" Diego looked at Ronald, then at Keanu. Then he took a deep breath and gave his answer. "No." Ronald blinked. "No." Diego stood up, his voice steady. "I don't want to work for someone who only respects me when it benefits them. I have my own path to follow." A slow smile spread across Keanu's face. The cafe erupted into applause again. Ronald looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have realized there was no winning this one. Without another word, he turned and left, his retreat far quieter than his entrance. As the door shut behind him, Keanu let out a chuckle. Damn, that was satisfying. Diego finally allowed himself to exhale. His heart was still racing, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from frustration. It was from clarity. "You have a plan?" Keanu asked. Diego thought about it, really thought about it. Then, for the first time in years, he said something out loud that he had only ever whispered to himself. "I want to open my own restaurant." Keanu grinned. "Now that's something I'd invest in." Diego's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Keanu shrugged. "I know good food. I know hard work. And I know when someone has something special. You do. So, let's make it happen." Diego stared at him, his whole world shifting in an instant. "Think about it," Keanu said, standing up. "Dreams are expensive, but they're worth it." And with that, he picked up his coffee and walked out into the city streets, leaving Diego standing there, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. Because for the first time in his life, his dream felt possible. A decision to make. Diego Alvarez stood behind the cafe counter, his mind spinning in a way it never had before. Keanu Reeves had just offered to invest in his dream. The words still echoed in his head. He had spent years working 3 jobs, scrimping and saving, pushing himself past exhaustion just to send money back home. The thought of opening his own restaurant had always seemed like a fantasy, something for people with money, connections, and privilege, not for someone like him. But now, it wasn't just a dream. It was a possibility. Susan, his manager, approached him cautiously. "Diego." He blinked, snapping out of his daze. "Yeah. Are you okay? You've been standing there like a statue for the past 5 minutes." Diego exhaled, running a hand over his face. I don't know. I think Keanu Reeves just changed my life." Susan laughed, though there was a hint of awe in her voice. "Yeah, I think so too." But just as Diego was beginning to process everything, the cafe doors swung open once again. And this time, it wasn't Keanu Reeves or Ronald Spencer. It was a group of high-profile chefs, dressed in crisp white jackets, polished shoes, and an air of arrogance that filled the entire space. At the front stood Marcus Caldwell, a renowned executive chef who had been featured in multiple culinary magazines. He was the head of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, Le Chateau Lumiere, a place where a single meal could cost more than Diego made in a month. The cafe went dead silent. Marcus stepped forward, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Diego. "You must be the man of the hour," he said smoothly. Diego frowned. I guess." Marcus smirked. "Word travels fast, my friend. It seems you've caught the attention of some important people." Susan stepped up protectively. "And what exactly do you want?" Marcus clasped his hands behind his back. "I heard about the little incident earlier." His smirk widened. And the fact that Keanu Reeves thinks you're the next big thing. Diego's stomach twisted. He didn't like where this was going. So here's the deal, Marcus continued. Ronald Spencer, yes, the same man you humiliated today, came straight to my restaurant after leaving here. He was, let's just say, not pleased. He told me that some random cafe worker refused his job offer and that Keanu Reeves thinks you can open a restaurant. Diego's pulse quickened. Marcus chuckled. So, naturally, I'm curious. Does Keanu Reeves actually know good food? Or is he just a Hollywood guy making a mistake? Diego's jaw clenched. Are you saying? Marcus leaned in slightly. I'm challenging you to a cooking duel. Gasps rippled through the cafe. Susan's eyes widened. What? You heard me, Marcus said, his voice dripping with amusement. You and me. A head-to-head cook-off. Tomorrow. My restaurant. Diego blinked. Why? Marcus shrugged. Simple. If you win, I'll personally endorse your restaurant and help you get a Michelin star chef to mentor you. The cafe burst into whispers. A Michelin star chef. That was huge. And if I lose? Diego asked carefully. Marcus grinned. You forget about opening a restaurant and go work for Ronald Spencer. Silence. The cafe held its breath. Diego had a choice to make. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was a battle of respect, pride, and opportunity. And then, from behind him, a familiar voice rang out. He accepts. Everyone turned to see Keanu Reeves stepping back inside the cafe, coffee in hand. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Oh, you're speaking for him now. Keanu smiled, completely unfazed. Nope, but I know he won't back down from a challenge. He glanced at Diego. Right. Diego hesitated for only a second. Then he lifted his chin, straightened his shoulders, and met Marcus's gaze head-on. Right. The cafe exploded in cheers. Marcus smirked. Perfect. Tomorrow. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. And with that, he turned and walked out, his entourage following. As the door shut behind them, Susan let out a shaky breath. Holy crap. Keanu grinned, clapping Diego on the back. You're gonna crush it. Diego exhaled, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Tomorrow was going to change everything. The preparation. That night, Diego didn't sleep. Instead, he stayed up practicing. Keanu had booked out a private kitchen for him. A sleek, professional space that felt nothing like the tiny food truck where Diego usually cooked. Okay, Keanu said, rolling up his sleeves. Let's talk strategy. Diego frowned. You know food. Keanu laughed. I know good food. And I know that this isn't just about cooking. It's about telling a story. Diego nodded slowly. His grandmother had always said that too. Food isn't just about taste. It's about heart. About the people who eat it and the people who make it. Marcus is going to make something expensive, complicated, and sophisticated, Keanu continued. You're going to make something that reminds people why they love to eat. Diego thought hard. Then he knew exactly what he was going to cook. A dish that told his story. The showdown. The next evening, the restaurant was packed. The crowd included celebrity chefs, food critics, influencers, and even a few Hollywood actors. Keanu was in the front row, grinning like a proud coach. Marcus stood at his station, preparing a dish that looked like something out of a five-star European restaurant. Gold leaf, truffle foam, a delicate tower of impossibly arranged seafood. Diego. He made tacos, but not just any tacos. Handmade tortillas, slow-braised barbacoa, roasted tomatillo salsa, queso fresco, and a drizzle of mole that had taken him hours to perfect. When the judges tasted Marcus's dish, they nodded, murmuring about the complexity and balance of flavors. Then they tasted Diego's. And the room fell silent. One judge, a woman who had barely spoken all night, took a deep breath and whispered, "This tastes like home." The final scores were announced, and Diego won. The cafe worker, the food truck cook, the man who had once been invisible to people like Marcus, he won. Keanu leaped to his feet, cheering. The crowd erupted. Even some of Marcus's own people clapped. Marcus, he just shook his head, looking both annoyed and impressed. "Damn," he muttered. Keanu was right. And just like that, Diego Alvarez became more than just a cook. He became a name. Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Now," he said, grinning, "let's open that restaurant." Diego smiled, heart pounding. Because this time, he knew it wasn't just a dream. It was real. Marcus is going to make something expensive, complicated, and sophisticated, Keanu continued. You're going to make something that reminds people why they love to eat. Diego thought hard. Then, he knew exactly what he was going to cook. A dish that told his story. The showdown. The next evening, the restaurant was packed. The crowd included celebrity chefs, food critics, influencers, and even a few Hollywood actors. Keanu was in the front row, grinning like a proud coach. Marcus stood at his station, preparing a dish that looked like something out of a five-star European restaurant. Gold leaf, truffle foam, a delicate tower of impossibly arranged seafood. Diego. He made tacos, but not just any tacos. Handmade tortillas, slow-braised barbacoa, roasted tomatillo salsa, queso fresco, and a drizzle of mole that had taken him hours to perfect. When the judges tasted Marcus's dish, they nodded, murmuring about the complexity and balance of flavors. Then they tasted Diego's, and the room fell silent. One judge, a woman who had barely spoken all night, took a deep breath and whispered, "This tastes like home." The final scores were announced, and Diego won. The cafe worker, the food truck cook, the man who had once been invisible to people like Marcus, he won. Keanu leaped to his feet, cheering. The crowd erupted. Even some of Marcus's own people clapped. Marcus, he just shook his head, looking both annoyed and impressed. "Damn," he muttered. Keanu was right. And just like that, Diego Alvarez became more than just a cook. He became a name. Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Now," he said, grinning, "let's open that restaurant." Diego smiled, heart pounding. Because this time, he knew it wasn't just a dream. It was real. The victory that changed everything. The moment Diego Alvarez heard his name announced as the winner, it felt like time stopped. The noise around him, the cheers, the applause, the gasps of shock from some of the industry elites faded into the background. He had done it. He had just beaten Marcus Caldwell, one of the most respected chefs in the city. And he had done it with tacos. Not with fancy French techniques, not with molecular gastronomy, not with an expensive truffle-infused dish, but with the flavors of his home, of his childhood, of his grandmother's kitchen. Keanu Reeves was the first to break the moment. He jumped to his feet and clapped Diego on the back, grinning. "I knew it," he said. "I knew you'd win." Diego exhaled, still processing everything. He shook his head, his voice failing him for a second. "I can't believe it." Marcus Caldwell, the man Diego had just defeated, took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room watched in silence, waiting to see how he would react. Diego braced himself for some kind of insult, some kind of excuse. Instead, Marcus extended his hand. "You proved me wrong," he said, his voice even, but there was a flicker of respect in his sharp blue eyes. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake." Diego hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and shook it firmly. Marcus smirked slightly. "Don't let it go to your head," he added. "I'll win next time." Diego let out a short laugh. "You can try." The audience erupted in another wave of cheers, and suddenly Diego wasn't just a cafe worker anymore. He was someone people wanted to know. As the crowd surrounded him, offering congratulations and asking about his future plans, Keanu leaned in close and whispered, This is your moment, Diego. But don't just enjoy it. Use it. Diego met his gaze. Keanu was right. This wasn't just about winning a competition. This was his chance to finally break out, to take the leap towards something bigger. But he had no idea just how quickly that opportunity would come knocking. The power of word of mouth. By the next morning, Diego's victory had gone viral. Clips of the cook-off flooded social media. Food bloggers, restaurant critics, and even local news stations were talking about the unknown cafe worker who defeated a celebrity chef. People started showing up at Café Sol just to see Diego. The small cafe, which usually had a steady but manageable flow of customers, was suddenly overwhelmed. Diego barely had time to breathe. Orders flew in faster than he could keep up. Susan had to call in extra staff. People were asking to take pictures with him. And the best part, no one looked down on him anymore. He wasn't just the guy behind the counter or the immigrant cook. He was Diego Alvarez, and people respected him. One afternoon, as he was rushing to prepare an order, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first. He never had time to check his phone during a shift. But something in his gut told him this was different. During a quick break, he pulled it out and almost dropped it. An email from a Michelin-starred restaurant. And not just any restaurant, one of the best in the world. An offer he never expected. Later that night, after the cafe had finally closed, Diego sat down with Keanu at a small diner just outside the city. Keanu had insisted on celebrating, but Diego still felt like he was in a dream. He placed his phone on the table between them. "Read this," he said, sliding it toward Keanu. Keanu picked it up, skimmed through the email, and raised an eyebrow. "Well, Dan," he let out a low whistle. "They're offering you a job in New York." Diego nodded slowly. Not just a job, a full sponsorship. He swallowed hard. "They want me to train under one of the best chefs in the world. They said after seeing my performance against Marcus, they think I have serious potential." Keanu grinned. "Because you do." Diego rubbed his temples. "But if I go, it means leaving everything behind. It means starting over in a whole new city. I'd have to leave the cafe, the food truck, everything I've worked for." Keanu leaned forward. "Diego, be honest with yourself. What do you really want?" Diego hesitated. He had spent years grinding just to survive. For the first time, he had a real choice. "I want to open my own restaurant," he admitted. Keanu nodded. "Then the real question is, which path gets you there?" Diego thought about it long and hard. He could go to New York. He could train under a world-class chef, learn techniques that would elevate his cooking, and come back even stronger. But something didn't sit right. His heart was here, in LA. He wanted to build something here. And then, just as he was about to respond, another email popped up on his phone. This time, it was from a real estate agent. The subject line: "Available restaurant spaces for lease, per Keanu Reeves' request." Diego's head snapped up. "Keanu, what did you do?" Keanu took a sip of his coffee, completely unfazed. "Oh, I just did some research," he grinned. "Figured you might need a little push." Diego's mouth fell open. "Are you serious?" Keanu set his cup down and leaned in. "You're good, Diego. You don't need validation from a Michelin-starred restaurant to prove it. You already won against a world-class chef. People already know your name. So why waste years training under someone else when you could start your own thing right now?" Diego's heart pounded. "Listen," Keanu continued, his voice steady. "I told you before, I'd invest in you. And I meant it. But the question is, are you ready to bet on yourself?" Diego stared at him. Then, for the first time in his life, he knew the answer. "Yes." Keanu grinned. "Good, because I already scheduled a tour of restaurant spaces tomorrow." Diego shook his head, laughing in disbelief. "You really don't mess around, do you?" Keanu chuckled. "Life's too short for hesitation, my friend. Now let's build something great." the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Diego walked into the first restaurant space with a different kind of confidence. He wasn't just looking at an empty building. He was looking at his future. The space was perfect. Small, intimate, but full of character. The kind of place where people could feel at home. As he walked through the kitchen, he could already see it. The menu, the customers, the smell of slow-cooked barbacoa filling the air. Keanu stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "What do you think?" Diego turned to him, his chest tightening with determination. "I think this is it." Keanu nodded. "Then let's get to work." Diego took a deep breath, looking around one more time. This wasn't just a restaurant. This was his legacy. And this time, no one was going to look down on him again. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air as Diego Alvarez stood in the middle of what would soon become his restaurant. The space had once been a rundown diner, abandoned for years, but to him, it was a blank canvas, a place where he could build something real, something of his own. Keanu Reeves stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes scanning the half-finished walls and exposed ceiling beams. "I think it has character," Keanu said with a smirk. "Just needs some love." Diego chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, and a lot of money." Keanu shot him a look. "You let me worry about that. You just focus on making sure the food is as good as I keep telling people it is." The reality of it still hadn't fully sunk in. A month ago, he was working 3 jobs just to survive. Now he was about to open his own restaurant. He had spent the past few weeks working with contractors, picking out everything from tiles to kitchen equipment, barely sleeping, and pouring everything he had into making this dream a reality. But for all the progress they had made, there was still one nagging problem. People knew about his victory over Marcus Caldwell. They knew Keanu Reeves was backing him. But that didn't mean they'd come. Marcus's high-end restaurant had reservations booked months in advance. People would wait in line for hours to get a seat at some of the city's trendiest spots. Diego, he was an unknown name in the industry. The viral moment had been exciting, but people had short attention spans. If he didn't make a big impression from day one, his restaurant could flop before it even got a chance. Keanu seemed to read his thoughts. "You're overthinking," he said, clapping Diego on the back. "Trust me, once people taste your food, you won't have to worry about getting customers." Diego exhaled, forcing a smile. "I hope you're right." 2 weeks later, opening day finally arrived. By the time the restaurant's doors were set to open, Diego felt sick with nerves. He had stayed up the night before perfecting his menu, testing recipes, making sure everything was flawless. He had personally trained the small team of cooks he hired, some from Café Sol, some from the food truck world, all people who understood the heart of his cooking. The space looked perfect, warm, inviting, filled with details that reminded Diego of home. Bright, hand-painted tiles from Oaxaca lined the counter. The scent of slow-roasted meats, fresh tortillas, and smoky chiles filled the air. And yet, as he stood in the kitchen, waiting for the doors to open, a horrible thought crept into his mind. What if no one showed up? He had seen it happen before, restaurants opening with big dreams, only to be empty within weeks. Just because he had beaten Marcus Caldwell in a one-time contest didn't mean people would actually pay to eat his food. Then, at exactly 5:59 p.m., Diego took a deep breath and nodded at his team. "Let's do this," he said. They unlocked the doors, and for the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. The restaurant was quiet, too quiet. Diego's stomach churned. Had he miscalculated? Had people already forgotten about him? Then, just as the doubt was beginning to settle in, the first customer walked in. An older woman, walking with a cane, scanning the restaurant with curiosity before approaching the counter. Diego immediately stepped forward. "Welcome," he said, forcing the nerves from his voice. "First time here." The woman smiled. "I saw you on the news. Thought I'd see if the food was really as good as they said. Diego nodded. I hope I don't disappoint. What can I get you? She studied the menu, then looked back at him. What would your grandmother have recommended? Diego felt a lump in his throat. The barbacoa tacos, he said softly. Then that's what I'll have, she said. He went to work, hands moving on instinct, preparing the tacos with the same care he had since he was a child watching his grandmother cook. When he placed the plate in front of her, his heart pounded in his chest. The woman picked up a taco, took a bite, and closed her eyes. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then she let out a sigh. This, she said, setting the taco down carefully, tastes like home. Diego barely had time to let her words sink in before the door opened again. And then again. And again. Within half an hour, the restaurant was packed. The line stretched out the door. They had done it. The rush was overwhelming. Diego barely had time to breathe as he and his small team pushed through the chaos. Orders flew in, plates went out. The kitchen roared with energy. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and everything he had dreamed of. Then, just when he thought the night couldn't get any crazier, Marcus Caldwell walked through the door. Diego nearly dropped the plate he was holding. The restaurant fell silent. People whispered. Someone pulled out their phone to record. Even Keanu, who had been casually helping in the back, stepped forward, curious. Marcus took his time, scanning the restaurant with a neutral expression before stepping up to the counter. Table for one? Diego asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. Marcus smirked. Not tonight. Just here for takeout. Diego nodded, trying to ignore the way his heart pounded. What can I get you? Marcus crossed his arms. What's your best dish? Diego thought about it. Then, without hesitation, he said, the birria. Marcus nodded. Then that's what I'll have. Diego went to work, ignoring the fact that all eyes were still on him. He focused, prepared the dish with care, placed it in a takeout container, sealed it tight, and handed it over. Marcus took the bag, studied him for a long moment, then said something Diego never expected. You're going to be a problem for a lot of chefs in this city, he said. They won't like it. Diego raised an eyebrow. And you? Marcus's lips quirked up. I respect it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The moment the door shut behind him, the restaurant exploded into cheers. Keanu let out a loud laugh. Damn, man. You really made it. Diego exhaled, his entire body buzzing with exhaustion, adrenaline, and something else. Pride. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a cook. He was a chef. Diego Alvarez barely had time to process what had happened that night. His restaurant had opened its doors for the first time, and by the end of the evening, they had sold out of everything. The kitchen was a disaster zone. His team was running on fumes, and he was physically drained. But none of it mattered, because the restaurant was a success. Even after the last customer had left, after the tables had been wiped down, and the floors had been swept, Diego stood in the middle of his dining room, staring at the empty plates stacked near the kitchen, trying to wrap his head around the fact that just a few months ago, this place had been nothing. Just an idea, a far-off dream, an impossible goal he had buried beneath the weight of survival. Now, it was real. It was his. Keanu Reeves leaned against the counter, watching Diego with an amused expression. You gonna stand there all night, or are you finally gonna sit down? Diego let out a breath and sank into a chair. His legs ached, his back was sore, and his hands were still covered in traces of masa and spices. Keanu slid a cold beer across the table. You earned it. Diego took a long sip, letting the cool liquid soothe his throat. He glanced around the room, taking in every small detail, the handmade tiles, the flickering candlelight, the lingering scent of roasted chiles and fresh tortillas. He had built this, every piece of it. Keanu smirked. So, how's it feel? Diego exhaled. Like I'm dreaming. Nah, Keanu said, shaking his head. This is real. And you're the real deal. Diego chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know about that. Keanu leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. You still don't get it, do you? Look around. You did this, Diego. You took something that people thought was impossible, and you made it happen. Diego ran a hand through his hair, still trying to absorb the weight of it all. He had always believed that success belonged to other people, people with money, people with connections, people who hadn't spent years being overlooked. But tonight had proven something to him. Maybe success wasn't just for the privileged. Maybe it was for the ones who fought for it. As they sat in the quiet restaurant, a knock on the door made them both turn. Diego frowned. We're closed. But Keanu gave him a knowing look. Something tells me you'll want to open up for this one. Diego got up and walked to the door. When he pulled it open, his breath caught. Standing there, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, was an old man. His skin was weathered from years of sun, deep lines carving stories into his face. His clothes were simple, his posture slightly hunched with age. But it was his eyes that stopped Diego in his tracks, because they were just like his grandmother's. The old man nodded respectfully. Eres el chef. Diego swallowed hard. Sigh, Segor. The man smiled and held out the bundle. Entonces, esto es para ti. Diego carefully took it and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a single, perfectly made tortilla. Warm, soft, the edges slightly crisp from the comal. His throat tightened. The old man chuckled at his expression. Vine a probar tu comida. Escuche cocinas con el corazón. Diego could barely find his voice. Lo intento. The man nodded approvingly. Se nota. He turned, preparing to leave, but Diego suddenly spoke. Espere. The man paused. Diego gestured inside. Dejim cocinar algo. The old man hesitated, then smiled. Si insists. Diego led him to the best seat in the house and went to work. The exhaustion melted away. His muscles still ached, but now, every movement felt purposeful. He was no longer just making food. He was honoring something bigger. He plated the dish carefully and set it in front of the old man. The first bite was slow, thoughtful. Then the man nodded, closing his eyes briefly. Esto se va casa. Diego felt something in his chest loosen. When the man finished eating, he stood, placed a few bills on the table, and placed a hand on Diego's shoulder. Tu abuela estario, orgullosa. Diego felt his breath hitch. The old man smiled and walked out into the night, disappearing into the city streets. Keanu, who had watched the entire exchange in silence, exhaled. That, he said quietly, was something special. Diego sat down, staring at the door. He felt something shift inside him, something that had been waiting for years to be understood. It wasn't about the fame. It wasn't about proving himself to people like Marcus Caldwell. It wasn't even about money. It was about legacy. About making food that mattered. Food that carried memories. Food that made people feel something. Keanu clinked his bottle against Diego's. So, what's next? Diego smiled, the answer clearer than ever. Everything. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Diego Alvarez's restaurant, casting a golden glow on the rustic wooden tables and vibrant, hand-painted tiles. The scent of slow-cooked meats and freshly pressed tortillas still lingered in the air from the night before, mixing with the faintest hint of coffee and warm cinnamon. It was a new day, but Diego had barely slept. He stood behind the counter, staring out at the empty dining area, his mind racing. He had done it. The restaurant had opened. The city had noticed, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a place, a real place, one where he didn't just serve food. He told stories through it, but something inside him wouldn't let him settle. Keanu Reeves had asked him a question last night. What's next? And Diego knew the answer couldn't be just this. He had spent too many years working in the shadows, too many nights wondering if his hard work would ever pay off. Now that he had a seat at the table, he wasn't just going to enjoy the meal. He was going to change the menu. The soft jingle of the front doorbell broke his thoughts. Diego looked up to see Susan, his former manager from Café Sol, stepping inside. She still wore the same warm, confident smile he had seen every morning for years, but today there was something different in her eyes. Pride. "Look at this place," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "I still can't believe you pulled it off." Diego chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Me neither." She walked up to the counter and leaned in. "But I know you, Diego. You're already thinking about what's next." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want this to just be another trendy restaurant that people talk about for a few months and forget. I want it to be more than that. I want it to mean something." Susan studied him for a moment, then smirked. "Then make it mean something." She wasn't wrong. The food world was fickle. A place could be hot one month and forgotten the next. But Diego had never been interested in playing that game. This wasn't just about keeping a restaurant alive. It was about creating a movement. The next few weeks flew by in a blur. The restaurant continued to gain momentum. Diego found himself featured in magazines, interviewed on local news, and even invited to cook at exclusive events. His birria tacos became legendary, with food critics raving about the depth of flavor, the richness of the consommé, the way the dish carried the heart of his culture with every bite. But the thing that meant the most: the people. It wasn't just high-end foodies coming in. It was the workers, the immigrants, the people who had never stepped foot in a Michelin-starred restaurant because they never felt like those places were made for them. Diego watched as construction workers sat next to film producers, as dishwashers ate alongside tech executives, as entire families gathered at his tables and stayed for hours, laughing, talking, sharing. And that's when he realized what his real mission was. One night, after the last customer had left, Keanu showed up, like he always did when Diego least expected it. "You look like a man with an idea," Keanu said, pulling up a stool at the counter. Diego leaned against the counter and exhaled. "I don't just want to run a restaurant, Keanu. I want to change the way people see food." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Diego wiped his hands on a towel and set it aside. "You know how most fine dining places are all about exclusivity, about making people feel like they need to earn the right to eat there." Keanu nodded. "I want to do the opposite," Diego said, his voice firm. "I want to create a place where food isn't about status. It's about connection. A place where the cooks in the back get as much respect as the chefs up front. Where immigrants can come and taste the food that reminds them of home. Where kids who never saw someone like them in a kitchen can see that they belong here too." Keanu's lips curled into a slow smile. "You're not just talking about a restaurant anymore." Diego shook his head. "No, I'm talking about a movement." Keanu sat back, crossing his arms. "All right, what's the plan?" Diego took a deep breath. "First, I want to start a culinary mentorship program. For every big-name chef who gets a spotlight in the industry, there are 100 workers in the back of the kitchen who never get a chance to grow. I want to give them that chance. Bring in young cooks who come from places like I did. Undocumented workers, kids from struggling families, people who have the talent but not the opportunity. Train them, teach them, and then send them out to start their own businesses." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "That's vague." Diego wasn't finished. "And I want to change the way people experience food. I want to open more locations, but not the way chains do. Every spot should be a reflection of the community it's in. The menu should evolve based on the people who work there. It should never be about making food that impresses critics. It should be about making food that means something to the people eating it." Keanu was grinning now. "You know what you're doing, right?" Diego raised an eyebrow. You're revolutionizing the industry, Keanu said, shaking his head. Most people open one restaurant and spend their whole lives just trying to keep it running. You're already thinking 10 steps ahead. Diego shrugged. I spent my whole life working for someone else. If I'm going to build something, I'm going to build it right. Keanu raised his beer bottle in salute. To the future. Diego clinked his bottle against Keanu's. But before he could take a sip, the restaurant door swung open. A young boy, no older than 10, peeked inside. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, but his eyes were wide with curiosity. Can I help you? Diego asked. The boy hesitated, then pointed at the kitchen. Are you the chef? Diego set his beer down and walked over. He crouched so he was at eye level with the kid. Yeah, I am. The boy swallowed. Can I be a chef too? Diego felt his chest tighten. He didn't need to ask the boy where he came from or what his story was. He already knew. He smiled. Not only can you be a chef, he said, but one day you'll be even better than me. The boy's face lit up. Diego reached into the kitchen, grabbed a freshly made tortilla, and handed it to him. A chef's gotta taste everything. Tell me what you think. The boy took a bite. His eyes widened. He grinned. It tastes like my abuelitas. Diego ruffled his hair. That means you've got good taste. The boy ran off, disappearing into the night, but Diego stood at the door for a long time, watching the empty street, feeling something shift inside him. This wasn't just about food. It never had been. This was about building something that lasted. Not just a restaurant, not just a career, a legacy. And Diego Alvarez was just getting started.